Hello, SPC followers. Welcome back to another episode. I've got a little explaining to do for this one, but I think you're going to like it, so bear with me a little bit. Once I bring you up to speed, we'll get on to the main attraction for episode 79, and that's a very fascinating discussion with Alex from FlyShirley.com, an AI startup that's all about aviation. So let's get into it.
Chandler Tower, Cherokee 4121 Tango is at Chandler Air Service. We have Zulu, and we'd like a south departure, please.
What does it say to be an angel? Where does the sun go when it sleeps? Is every star that shines so brightly in the sky another promise I must keep? I should by now. It isn't written in the stars.
All right, so a bit of an explanation before we dive into it. I'll be brief because this is going to be a long episode anyway. But I decided when I published episode 78, the last episode in late September, that I needed a bit of a break. So I decided to take my birthday month, October, off from the podcast while I recharged a little bit. We had some changes happening with the almost launched fledgling Flightline podcast that I'll get into in a little bit. But I just needed to take a little break. So I got some episodes partially ready and held off on publishing supposedly until November. As you know, at that same time, I've been trying to get my CFI check ride scheduled for ages, and I wasn't sure when it would happen. But then, last couple of days of October, I finally got the call. I got a check ride scheduled at an airport about 60 nautical miles away from my home airport for a couple of weeks in the future. So now, about the time I was going to be starting the podcast publishing again, my focus turned to relearning how to fly and how to pass a CFI check ride. As you can imagine, all my focus turned towards that. And once again, I had to forgo publishing for a little bit. I had a lot of cool stuff already in the can, but now didn't have time to finish the edits and do final publishing, etc. So I decided to wait another month. The good news is I passed my check ride, so I'm a brand new CFI. The bad news is I ended up taking 2 months off from the publishing instead of the one that I had originally planned. That said, I'm now back, and I've been wanting to get this one out for quite a while. It's really interesting. Now, there's one more thing. Tiffany and I originally recorded this for, like I said, the fledgling Flightline podcast. So that's what you'll hear when we're talking to Alex. A couple of months ago, though, Tiffany and I decided to pause the launch of that podcast, at least for a while, as her situation was changing and we couldn't put the focus on it that we had hoped we'd be able to. We want to do it at some point, somehow, but the good news is I can focus on the Student Pilot Cast even more. And since we already have a community of listeners here, I'm glad that this interview will get more eyeballs and more ears on it anyway by releasing it as a Student Pilot Cast episode. As you'll see from the discussion, it does have a bit of a student and learning orientation anyway, so it fits right in. So you're basically up to speed at a very high level, and we're back to publishing weekly for the Student Pilot Cast. I certainly appreciate everyone's patience as I recharged and then supercharged for my check ride, and then relaxed a bit over the Thanksgiving holiday. So I hope everyone also had a good relaxing holiday. As always, please reach out with questions, suggestions, ideas, feedback, everything. You can find me via email at bill@studentpilotcast.com or use the contact form on the website, or even via X at BillWill. That's Bravo India Lima Lima, Whiskey India Lima. So with that said, I hope you enjoy episode 79 and Don't Call Me Shirley. All right, welcome back everybody to the Flightline podcast. We've got a really special episode tonight. We're sitting here with Alex List, who's part of the team at FlyShirley. And Alex and I met sort of in happenstance while we were looking at one of the other vendors at Oshkosh that had to do with large language models and what we sometimes refer to as AI. And so we got to talking and said, hey, you know what? We should really get together and talk about this on the podcast. So, Alex, welcome to the Flightline podcast.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you and Tiffany.
Excellent. So, tell us a little bit about first Alex, and then we'll get to FlyShirley.
Sounds great. So my background is actually in apps and technology. So in high school, I taught myself how to program iPhones. I had some of the first iPhones in the App Store, ended up winning an Apple Design Award. I got into MIT and I decided to study aerospace because I felt I already knew computer science somehow. And so I studied that for 3 years. I ended up dropping out and making a startup, coming back and switching to computer science. And then I got my private pilot's license, went back, got my master's in kind of a combination between aerospace engineering and computer science. And I ended up having the opportunity to lead flight simulation at a company called Beta Technologies up in Vermont. They're an electric vertical takeoff and horizontal flight airplane company. They make some of the, I would say, some of the coolest electric airplanes, but also have some of the best sims that you'd ever see on the planet. These amazing full dome, half dome, wraparound flight sims. Really, really sweet. I worked on enabling the simulated flight test and instructor operating stations, helping with the avionics transition. Had the opportunity to bring some of my thesis work into the avionics. When you're flying these new airplanes, it's a little bit different. And and we ended up building about 8 different VR sims and flight domes throughout the country. So I left when the airplane was entering production and worked at a leading aircraft autonomy company and had the opportunity to work with some really great folks over my career. Ended up starting FlyShirley in March after some, and we can get into this a little bit more, after there was a little bit of an accident that my friend had. And I wanted to be able to build something that could make a difference for aviation safety. And so I started by building something that you could fly with in a cockpit. And so you could fly with Shirley while I was flying my DA-42. I could ask questions and things like this, but there's some limitations. And so one of my friends actually, I have a couple friends at X-Plane, and they said, hey, why don't you try launching for sims first? You wouldn't have the issue with hallucination. This wouldn't be a problem. You wouldn't have issues trying to keep things online versus offline. And you would be able to sort of deal with all these noise issues really easily. So anyway, we launched for Flight Sim starting at Flight Simulator Expo, and then ended up here. And I'm really happy to see you guys and talk to you a little bit about this sort of journey and the application.
All right. I'm itching to get into some of that tech that you're talking about, but I'm going to hold off because I want to ask, why aviation? What got you into aviation in the first place? You said you started with aerospace at MIT, and then you became a private pilot. How did that happen? Why?
So that's actually that's a great question. So I always was interested in space as a kid. It's huge sort of, buffs for all the sci-fi movies, runs in the family. I wanted to be, like a lot of folks, I wanted to be an astronaut, but you do the sort of the expected value calculation on that, and it kind of falls a little bit short. And so I thought to myself, what's the opportunity that you'd have the sort of the best shot, but you could still kind of, fly around in air or space? And of course, the answer to that is being a private pilot or becoming a pilot in general. And so, I decided to get my private pilot's license, and it was probably one of the best decisions. You have the ability to you have a superpower, right? You could just show up somewhere,
You have a flying carpet.
Most people can't do that,
right?
You have a flying carpet.
Real,
yeah,
honest to goodness flying carpet. It's amazing.
It's just the coolest thing you could possibly do. So there's we're blessed to be in the United States, and I think just having this many sort of GA airports around in this country is just such a phenomenal resource for, for of course all the municipalities that they're in, but also for the individuals who can end up being pilots and sort of embracing this love of flight that I had, my teammates at Shirley share, and that, of course all of us here on the podcast and listening do as well.
Yeah, I was looking at your LinkedIn, and I have to say that between you and the other two co-founders, you guys look like a bunch of slackers. I mean, what's this 5.0 at MIT from Sam? So it looks like there's three of you guys who practice this.
You guys should
Obviously
really buckle
incredibly
down
intelligent.
and do something.
Yeah, exactly. How did you guys all
Yeah,
meet
yeah.
up, and whose idea was this?
So, I was fortunate to meet Seb. Seb, I actually met, he was an intern of mine while at Beta Technologies. He was he had just finished his freshman year at McGill, and he's sort of looking for something to do. He grew up in Vermont. Beta's up in Vermont. And Kyle, the CEO of Beta, said, well, you should check out this guy, you might not, have a ton of CS experience yet, but, he can work really hard. You should try it. You should give him a shot. And so, gave Seb a shot, and 3-4 years later, I'm a co-founder with him at my current startup. And so, I left my job at Merlin Labs in March and worked on the first prototype of FlyShirley that you could fly with. I ended up, getting convincing some of my friends and family to help me sort of stretch this a little bit farther. I was really lucky to meet Sam. There's for people who like to start companies and are sort of interested in this sort of thing, there are these sort of Tinder for co-founder type of websites that are as much of a crapshoot as any sort of dating app you could possibly imagine. But in this particular circumstance, Sam wrote me the nicest message ever. He said, well, actually, we went to the same college, all the same sort of things.
Yeah.
So, all right, we'll leave it at that. But, he just wrote out a very respectful message. Of course, his background, he interestingly was one of the first. He's actually in the Army for another couple of years at least. And he was actually one of the first people to go through the BR training sort of program they had in the Army, the initial one, and for helicopter training. And so, that's a really interesting experience. He flies the 6500 airplane. He's as a fixed wing operator there. And, his first sort of detachment in the Army, if you will, was to go to MIT and get a master's. And so, just a really good initial group of people. And so that's a little bit how we got together. I'm actually surprised that I didn't meet Sam while I was at MIT. By all rights, I should have.
You were there at the same time?
Yeah, things that. Yeah, we were there at
Okay.
the same time. So
All right.
yeah,
And you're all pilots?
yeah, hopefully. So yes, so Sam flies helicopters and the Global 6500. The Seb is a student pilot, and I'm a commercial multi-engine instrument pilot. I'm looking forward to getting my instructor pilot's license.
Awesome.
And learning about some of those fundamentals of instruction. But we love flight. Yeah.
Awesome. And did I hear you say you fly a DA-42? Is that what you said?
That's what I fly. Yes, I fly actually out of Philadelphia Northeast Airport. That's where my family lives, is in sort of the Philadelphia area. So I end up going down there. I get to fly the DA-42. Actually, one of the coolest things that I've done in that airplane was at the eclipse that kind of ripped through the United States from Texas up to New York, and out in the I ended up flying up there with my partner, me and her ended up flying up in there and seeing this amazing 360-degree sunset. And I was still looking through these little glasses, and I was look down at the instruments, and then I look back and see this amazing sort of white corona, and it's just sparkling in a most resplendent way you've ever seen in your life. So I would recommend it, not to the point where you don't listen to your TCAS,
Right.
but absolutely go check it out. You'd be in good company.
I wasn't in the air for that eclipse, but I did go to Totality in Texas, and it was one of the most incredible things I've ever experienced. So I can imagine it must have been incredible in the air too.
You see this sort of wall of darkness kind of flying towards you.
Yes.
At
Yes.
insane speed. You think it's just absolute just rain, like the thickest rain you've ever seen in your entire life. But then it passes you, and then you start to see the sort of the light coming around the same way, and just sunset in all directions.
Everybody made fun of me for my reaction to it because it made me feel so small and so energized at the same time. It was incredible. Yeah.
And in the cockpit, it really starts to get cold, and that's interesting.
Yes.
Like within seconds, you're turning the heat on.
Yeah.
Yeah, within moments.
Interesting.
You're just, yeah.
Well, I don't
anyway.
know that I'll be around for the
It's
next
great.
one that happens in North America, because I am kind of an old guy. But but if I am
Bill,
still
here we go
around
again.
and I still have a medical, I might have to try it from the cockpit next time. So that's a great idea.
Let's go. I'll bring you.
There we go.
No matter what. Yeah.
Excellent.
In any form.
Well, thanks for all that background. So, one of the things you mentioned, and as you've sent us information about FlyShirley, it's clear that, like you said, you started with Sims. Tell us what your approach was with Sims, and then where you're at with the product as it pertains to flying in actual airplanes.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So Shirley is designed to be your AI co-pilot from sim to sky. It's set up so that pilots can just talk to Shirley naturally, just like a co-pilot friend sitting next to them in the cockpit. So Shirley provides training in the sim to help people prepare for lessons and check rides and proficiency. And so our goal has always also been to bridge people from sim to sky. And so in the long term, we're working towards being able to have Shirley apply back in the cockpit. And so, our approach starting with the sim has been to sort of home sim flight users, people who actually just, Microsoft Flight Simulator released a metric, 15 million users at Microsoft, at Flight Sim Expo, they made this new metric, 15 million users, Microsoft Flight Simulator. Sort of this amazing sort of trend of getting more and more people involved, interested in flight through the sort of sim community. And so, we've started with a co-pilot that just really easily connects to X-Plane. We're starting with X-Plane because we're friends with the X-Plane guys. Essentially, all you need to do is you open a web browser and then you go to FlyShirley.com and then you hit start call and immediately Shirley's talking to you and sort of says sort of airplane teammate stuff, mic check when ready. And then you hit connect to X-Plane. You don't have to install any plugin or anything like that as long as you have X-Plane 12. And then it just immediately connects and has a window seat into your sim. And so we just start with this sort of, this AI kind of co-pilot. Shirley's your co-pilot. You talk. Shirley immediately replies. You end up having this kind of nice conversation no matter where you're at. Shirley has an idea of where you are, can give you info about where you're flying to. So we sort of have three different sort of modes. But we're starting here with this sort of home flight sim. And so folks there, some people just want to, try out different airplanes, cruise around different areas. There's all sorts of reasons why people do sort of home flight simming. Mm-hmm. And then there's sort of you've introduced a sort of challenge feature as well that, we can make challenges. Other people could build challenges as well. So the first one is this ALIA 250 flight training type of challenge where, X-Plane ships with a model of the ALIA 250 in VTOL mode. And so with that challenge, essentially Shirley is stepping you through, the controls check, stepping you through the sort of initial, how do you hover, how do you have control in that sort of mode, and then how do you transition out and sort of transition back in. And so Shirley kind of walks you through this in a sort of automated fashion. Challenges are really set up for other people to be able to kind of build fun little interactive capabilities. And we have the sort of for people who use ChatGPT or whatever, we have already sort of, example prompts that you would just follow and be able to create these things. And things like stall challenges that are possible, sort of this, you can have landing challenges of different sorts and explore different areas that you're interested in. We also just launched on Friday, we just launched a sort of the first version of our private pilot curriculum. And so that's really the sort of the first step into training. And private pilot curriculum is really interesting. We end up being able to teach people about some level of, taxiing, from the fundamentals of, what do you do? What does it feel like to actually take a lesson? But to also let people be prepared for their lessons. So let's say you just went out and did sort of turns about a point with your instructor. And now, you're going to go make sure you got it by next week. And you're going to go your instructor's either going to test you at the beginning of the lesson and then have you do something else, or they'll test you at the lesson. And if you don't do it, they're going to make you do it again. And so maybe you'll go and, prepare for that lesson and be able to make sure you really nail it when you get back. And one of the things that we provide with Shirley is sort of feedback while you're doing the maneuver, but we also keep the sort of a data log of you doing that and are able to sort of chart it out. Shirley's able to talk to you about sort of the sort of the flight data and sort of your results. You have sort of a indication of what would be to the ACS standards. So some people would really like to be able to prepare for their for their sort of check ride because it's pretty expensive and it's pretty high stress. You don't want to, mess up. And so, to varying levels depending on the fidelity of somebody's sim and their setup and all these different things, we can provide value based on our private pilot curriculum. And so that's live right now. And then we're also sort of working to bridge our way into different levels of kind of commercial environments. We have a sort of a pilot program with actually beta starting September, where we're going to be providing that sort of, training, sort of familiarization to the employees of the company so that they can, when they have VR seats throughout the company. And so when an employee comes by, they can just sort of sit down in the seat and be able to try it out, be able to how do I actually fly this airplane? I kind of forget. I had it on my first day as a lesson and for an orientation, but I really just want to see what it's like in order to fly Leah again. And it's really fun and kind of interactive and can be pretty inspiring for the employees. Also looking at commercial opportunities at various levels. For instance, if somebody has a aviation advanced training device that, one of the really interesting trends I think is that those are starting to be reduced in price. They're now also, there's also VR type AATDs. Loft Dynamics is a company that's got certified FAA now for for an Airbus. And so one of the cool things is that as instructors are really in high demand, just like pilots are really in high demand, Shirley can provide training that prepares people for their instruction appointments. And one of the things that we're looking to do is be able to provide sort of both Shirley providing instruction, but also having the sort of channel to allow sort of remote instructors for people to check in. And this is sort of especially interesting for commercial operators like, companies at the same scale as JetBlue or American Airlines, United, et cetera, where you have to spend multiple weeks on site when you're trying to get a new type rating. And so if you were able to spend some time at home with your family, not have to, from the eyes of the operators, have to do the spend of being at a hotel, per diem, and all this other stuff, running around the flights, et cetera, displacing revenue fares, then, you'd be able to prepare, show up prepared, have check-ins with instructors remotely as you're preparing at home. And then sort of, show up for the 1 week where you need to have the full flight simulator and be able to have your 20 hours and then, you're good to go. But, this is sort of things that we're looking at and sort of, on the track towards getting, be able to bring Shirley back into the cockpit, where actually you begin by sort of taking some of the learnings and, working with some of, some of the folks that are amenable to saying, yeah, I support the mission. I'd love to be able to make flight safer. I'm in for sort of stuff like that. Then we're able to make some of these features that Shirley has in terms of interactability, conversationality, available on an iPhone so that pilots can talk to Shirley while they're flying. And that can provide a lot of sort of overhead, especially in a GA context to begin with, where task saturation, et cetera, is really hard. And sometimes, if you're flying in instrument conditions and then something breaks and now you need this number, you can't remember that thing. And it just ends up being a mess where you can just ask for the information. And this ends up being kind of thing. But we're kind of working our way back to there, which is where we started. And I think along the way, we're providing a really revolutionary training product that actually provides a lot of value for people. Surely folks should try it out at FlyShirley.com, but there's a free trial for that, but it's a really engaging sort of system and does, I think, quite a good job at being able to provide a level of training that helps people prepare for, lessons, check rides, and help them with proficiency too.
Excellent.
Can you set up a mock check ride?
Right. So one of the things that we're working towards, then there's two parts of that. One of them is sort of the oral examination part of that. And that part is actually pretty straightforward and pretty easy to do because, there's some aspect of a question bank. Maybe you've been talking to Shirley. Shirley has some ideas of things that you have your weak points over time. And so you can kind of have a conversation and be sort of grilled in the sort of similar way that you'd be grilled in person. And then there are those maneuvers aspects of it. And the maneuvers aspects of it is what's really neat about the ACS is that it really lays out the precise parameters, plus or minus 50 feet. Of course, they say things in the ACS like you can temporarily exceed these thresholds, but if you consistently exceed them, then that's a fail. So there's some soft barriers, and that's actually, to be totally honest, one of the really cool things about using this sort of new AI technology is that it has a lot more of a holistic view on how things are working. And so when you provide this sort of graph that shows how tolerances are exceeded temporarily, et cetera, then you really do get kind of like hear the whole story about, this is, if you were going to focus and you had time to focus on something, this is what you should focus on. But overall, you might, depending on the examiner, then you probably would squeak by. And so, so there's stuff like that. And, there's, so absolutely, that's one of the things they're looking to provide. And I think one of the major sources of value on top of helping people to prepare for their particular lessons and aspects like that. Of course, there's depending on the equipment that they have, and I think maybe we'll get into this a little bit more. There's different things that are probably best suited to help their training at home. A lot of people who are pilots have iPads, probably the majority of them by now, or iPhones. And so there's sort of, equipment amenable to that. The intersection of people that have amazing flight sims that have monitors like wrapping around, or VR headsets with like at the world edge leading kind of gaming computers. That's a much smaller subset of folks. But, there's these sort of interesting opportunities where you start to be able to expand, and sort of the trends in the industry are such that you start to be able to see that really good representative sims are sort of making it more out in the customer's hands. Microsoft Flight Simulator gets better and better, as does sort of the number of computers that can run something like X-Plane. And, there's the sort of VR headsets get really a lot cheaper and a lot more accessible. There's other aspects related to AI and also certified sims becoming more affordable and things like that. I think are really interesting trends right now. So, yeah, thanks.
And those are all sort of on your, I guess, your roadmap target list to investigate how Shirley specifically can enhance that experience.
Right. So, one of the interesting things that I've seen so you look at some folks, even some streamers, this person named Swiss001 who made a video about Shirley. It's pretty funny. We could link it or something. But the the thing that he says is that he got to start by learning with infinite flight, and so he got interested in being able to fly because he had this iPad app that showed him how to fly. And they're sort of they have a data interface where Shirley could very easily have a window seat into that sort of experience. They don't, their airplanes, they don't have sort of a very interactive sort of FMS or something like that.
Right.
But they do have sort of like a navigation system and things like that. So there's different levels, and sort of like also Microsoft Flight Simulator on the Xbox. People can be able to fly using a remote, or like a gamepad, but they can also attach sort of yokes and things like that to it. And then, you look at the folks that have sort of a single monitor, or even MacBook Pros now can all run X-Plane 12 like really well because they have these amazing processors on them. And even with this, either on the laptop or with the monitor, that makes it a really, really quite reasonable IFR platform for training. If you want to be able to do something where you have representative maneuvering, then you either need to get really fancy with the way you sort of map, keys on your yoke for looking left or looking right, or you need to have multiple monitors. But then you can start to use something like X-Plane, which has a really, very impressive flight model even for slow flight, in order to be able to see kind of realistically touchdowns, takeoffs, and be able to do some sort of stalls and things like that. And so, there's just already a total variety of different platforms where, where the application of Shirley makes some sense, where Shirley can provide help with sort of instrument procedures, give you the numbers, help you set up for the approaches, etc. Sort of judge how you did, where did you break out, where did you knock off, like things like that, and we're also looking at how to engage with how to bring. Also, flight instructors, of course, too, are such an important aspect. We really see Shirley as a tool to help people prepare for those lessons, especially since there is such a pilot shortage. 3,000 just in the United States by 2032, given the current trends and
Yeah.
things like that. They're only getting worse. And so,
Okay, I have a quick layman question here. So if I had
Sure,
a flight simulator right now, which I do not, what kind of guidance does it come with already? Or is all of a sudden FlyShirley like this holy cow moment? Like my nephew, he's working on his private right now at Cal Baptist. So he
Yeah.
takes his check ride in September. But like, let's say that he gets a flight simulator and he jumps on it and he's not a pilot. Is there any sort of tutorial or information? How do people learn how to fly on a flight simulator besides just game theory and trial and error?
So, we don't we don't exist within a vacuum for sure. There's actually a lot of precedent for both apps that people can add on for doing training on their sims, and also, of course, there's a whole cohort of people who have been doing sort of training content for sims. There's just so many like amazing creators that do this sort of thing, and so
But those would live on YouTube.
Yeah, and so actually a lot of people start to be interested in doing Sims things because they were somehow kind of cross-marketed on YouTube and have sort of a video that shows up. It's like, oh, here's this really cool person doing like, VTOL VR, which is this amazingly accessible sort of, fighter, sort of like DCS, but it's just really easy to get going. Or somebody sees an X-Plane demo where somebody's like, really being super concentrated, flipping switches on, the 737 or something like that. And people want to get involved with that. And so, what's interesting is that for sure we don't exist within a vacuum. So there have been historically companies that can provide a sort of standards-based, very specific kind of add-on that sets you up in a particular maneuver and then looks to see your altitude and sort of like really specifically has these triggers and is just very, very precise and gives you sort of like a percentage like score based on whether like how much and how long you were within tolerances. And if you're exactly at 100% the entire time, then, then you're the best. But, so, there was a whole generation prior of people who have been trying to build sort of, tools to help people with training. I think it's been hard to call those sort of teammates because they're not really, interactive, or co-pilots because, there have been sort of historically, there's a tool called Linda for the X-Plane 11 and 12, which is sort of like a co-pilot that's sort of for the Zebo mod, which is a popular kind of mod for a 737 that adds a lot more interactivity and a lot of really cool things in X-Plane. But, what Linda does is be able to sort of, you can use basic voice recognition that sort of matches commands like Alexa would in 2024 at least, and be able to basically, flip switches for you and things like that. The previous company I was talking about was sort of the sort of kind of laid out sort of parameters is something called Take Flight Interactive, even like Spore Use sells that sort of thing. There are really kind of innovative companies that also sell training. Sporties is a good example of that. For instance, they are working with Infinite Flight to try to provide lessons to certain degrees. Like in Infinite Flight, like they have their own sort of X-Plane scenarios sort of bundle. They of course have all their training. I did my instrument sort of ground school with them. And they also sell Microsoft Flight Simulator apparel for what it's worth. But the interesting thing about some of these opportunities, I would say, and these companies is that, they are not as interactive. I mean, fundamentally, what's been the new kind of breakthrough with all this AI is that now you can just have natural language be able to map into the whole space of possibilities for what you're supposed to do. And so right now, Shirley, for instance, you could just, for the home flight sim market, you can ask Shirley to put down the flaps, to like bring up the gear, to turn off the lights and things like that. Like, all these sort of, fundamental things. And just by using natural language, and you can sort of describe things, you can say, do this and that, and all those things happen. Versus, the issue with sort of speech recognition up until this point is that you just literally are translating speech into words And then
Right.
there's not sort of like an understanding layer. Whereas as people, we just sort of, we like hear a bunch of stuff and then we have like an idea of what already they wanted. And sort of like, we walk into a coffee shop and you can probably mumble some things and get a coffee.
Yeah.
And, that's maybe not the sort of deal if you just sort of like basic sort of speech recognition. So it's sort of the new, kind of standard is to kind of combine speech recognition plus some sort of intelligence. And that's absolutely what we're doing with Shirley, and have sort of a leg up on that. Yeah.
Cool.
This is awesome. I'm loving it. Sorry, Bill. I ended up getting a complete sinus infection for 2 weeks after my instrument. Just check right, which I passed, but I was just terrified of that one. And as you're talking, it's like, man, something like this would have been so helpful, just to sit with somebody else by yourself that is not a real person that you have to face, who's going to go, God, that chick's an idiot. So,
the instrument it can be brutal because you just have any random symbol on anything. And
Yep.
it's just, oh God, I don't never saw the DMER. Okay. Yeah, totally agree.
I don't know if we want to transition to this, but I am so curious. You had made a comment as to why you started this, what really brought that idea on. I'd love to hear that story.
Yeah. So, it was actually a kind of a tragic. It was a tragic event, really. I mean, a friend of mine crashed his cozy and ended up passing away through that. And when something like that happened, you sort of get kind of shaken out of whatever you're doing currently. For me, it was sort of I was running a flight sim team at Merlin, which is this great aviation autonomy company in Boston, and I sort of saw that there could be an opportunity to make aviation even somewhat safer. I don't know. Sometimes when you feel really powerless, you just try to figure out something you can do to help in some way, right? And so I thought like maybe there's some sort of a way to apply this new technology and be able to see if it make it safer. And while still appreciating aspects of flight being really worthwhile and fun and sort of kind of wondrous in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the things that flying through the eclipse made me remember was that flying is just incredibly beautiful. You notice it every a lot of afternoons and evenings when you fly into the sunset or something like that. And so starting by trying to see even just from a very direct way, does this actually improve flying? Is there an opportunity to actually make flying safer? And so things that I noticed immediately from a GA context were when there were issues that required digging through a POH, could be 1,000 pages long in the case of a DA42, or things that were like related to numbers that you had to keep on recalling that might not be able to do if your hands are actually on the controls, or if your autopilot is maybe a little unreliable, or if you're in the soup and you don't want to like move your head into weird directions. A lot of opportunities where folks in particular don't necessarily have a teammate or a co-pilot. It's true, right? If you're flying with a buddy or you got a friend, they can do a lot of this stuff, and it's like that's pretty great. But having an opportunity to have something you talk to about the flight, help you just kind of think things through, ended up being a pretty useful thing, at least from my perspective. It'd be pretty helpful, but you have to make sure that it's safe. There's no exceptions. Like you have to make sure that it's not making stuff up. It's not acting wild, that it can hear you, that it runs on your phone without melting your phone or making it like immediately drain and die from battery or something like that. And so, starting with sims and working your way back to flight seemed like the most responsible way into doing that, because, you'd be able to have the advantage of having a huge cadre of people in the sort of sim land to be able to try out the things that you're building in service of being able to make something work in flight. And, you'd be able to see whether you'd be able to see really quickly. People ask, I've learned people sort of celebrate that Shirley can talk about sports, things like that. And sort of, I see lots of fun stuff, So I learned from Shirley about the football formations that are good. Funny. And it's true, Shirley knows about all sorts of stuff because, there's a enormous sort of intelligence model behind it. And And so, like, of course, like, even Shirley could tell you about the best restaurants near the particular airport that you're flying over. Don't expect necessarily that Shirley off the bat would be able to do that on your phone, but, because it has to run offline in your pocket, or on your dashboard. But, we're kind of building up towards being able to provide things that are safe and also still conversational in the cockpit. Because it's when you're able to have that context, it's able to hear, hopefully, ideally also be connected into some aspect of the panel. So there's a lot of things to be figured out along that way. However, I think the sort of the value of having something or Shirley or something that you talk to while you're flying is absolutely there, but it takes a lot of work and you got to get it right. So that's what we're starting.
Right. It definitely takes not only practice and learning on the model and the intelligence models part, but it's going to take learning and practice from the pilots as well. So if you don't mind, I'm going to branch off into a couple of different areas, and I'm going to start with the product itself. And the vast opportunity tonight for me to geek out with you is there. And I want to do it on the aviator and aviation educator side, but I'm going to hold off on that for a second.
Perfect.
And I want to geek out on the actual product a little bit, if you don't mind. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions that take us down that road. First of all, I know this is an overloaded term. You're using a large language model. You're using an intelligence model. Do you call it AI, or do you stay away from that overloaded term?
That's a reasonable question. I think it is. Okay, so I think AI has become the suitcase term that defines the category of things that use large language models.
Yep.
There's a whole cadre of people that go into all sorts of rabbit holes about artificial intelligence, and then they're starting to worry about plotting robots and things like that don't necessarily make a lot of sense to me. But starting, I think you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. But there's absolutely something that makes Shirley AI. I mean, you can talk to Shirley about anything that you want, and there's totally the Shirley will try to bring you back into flight. That's that Shirley truly just kind of wants to fly with you and maybe not talk. You can see some of the videos that creators make, and they're trying to push Shirley in a different direction. But Shirley's like, well, maybe you want to fly because that can make you feel better. Yeah. And trying to kind of get away from like something. Yeah. But that's kind of my philosophical point on that, and we're not.
You're not against it. You're not against using the term, but you're also not defining the product as just AI. Is that fair?
Right. Shirley's when we say it's on our poster, I mean, Shirley's your AI co-pilot from sim to sky.
Okay. All right.
And so, we're providing a service where Shirley can be your co-pilot.
Perfect.
And so,
all right.
We could say something like, it's Shirley.
Well, this is the definitive test on if it's AI. Do you use Lisp anywhere in your product?
So
I couldn't resist. Like I said, I'm an old guy. So.
I have written programming languages and compilers, and I've programmed in a language called Haskell.
Oh yeah,
and things like that. Yeah. But nope, we're not using Lisp anywhere.
That was a joke. I did program in Lisp once, but it was in college. So that was a long time ago.
We're trying to be a successful company.
Right. All right. I couldn't resist. So a serious question though: how much of your model is running on the edge? And how much is bound to the cloud? And how are you navigating that? I mean, it's a tough balance.
Yeah. So some of the things that are really interesting about that. So right now, the quickest way to start a company is to use all cloud services in this space for sure. Right now, what we're doing is we are sort of setting ourselves up to be able to progressively run things more offline. And sort of what we're beginning with that is to build a system that, kind of encourages Shirley to be a little bit more judicious about replying. one of the interesting things about these sort of large models, you look at either, if you go to ChatGPT, you go to Claude or something like that, and you ask a question, it's always going to reply to something. And if you say, let's simulate a conversation, and you say, okay, thanks, and it says, see ya, and you say, bye, and then it says, bye, and you say, okay, and it says, all right, let me know if you missed it. And so, that could be sort of a mess. And so
It's like
one of the
saying
things
goodbye
we're
to your
working on-
significant other in high school.
You hang up.
Takes all night. No, you hang up. No,
Yeah, you hang up, Shirley. No, you hang up, Shirley. Enjoy your flight. I am. Yeah, great. And so, that's something that you watch some videos. There's a wonderful channel, Virtual Aviation Aviator. Frank's been providing a ton of sort of feedback to us, and just watching his videos. Of course, you learn that things that can be a little bit challenging, like Shirley being over ambitious about replying. And so, the first sort of segment for building things that go more towards the edge are sort of models that sort of tell us whether or not Shirley actually needs to reply or not, and things like that. And so, and when, and things like that. And so, start with that, and then of course the model which is going to run on the iPhone is going to run entirely offline. So that's really good. But I think what's neat is the amount of progress that these sort of hosted cloud models have been making. It's just phenomenal. I mean, right now you can almost, right now Shirley can totally comprehend these sort of data graphs that we're providing to it, and there's sort of charts and things like that, and all sorts of things you find in the AFD that just by looking at them, there could be some sort of evidence. So, there's lots of real benefits to using things that exist on the cloud, as well as they have really well-defined sort of, they are respecting the rights of, users, et cetera, related to privacy, and not necessarily training on their data. So we could kind of do it in a very judicious way where, where we are, of course, we're collecting some of the text of the conversations, but before we do anything with it, we're anonymizing it, and sort of hitting it with the pass to make sure there's nothing wild in there. And we kind of encourage users not to share social security numbers and things like that with Shirley, but just in case it did, then sort of hit it with that. And we'll also, we're still early, but we'll figure out a way of letting people sort of opt out. But I think sort of the mission is something that people will hopefully continue to opt into, because we're looking to be able to provide sort of training, but also Shirley in flight. Yeah. And the best way to be able to do that is by being able to use some of these conversations and make something that's really small behave a lot better.
Right. I mean, these are all kind of typical challenges that you have around AI and large language model learning, right? So has latency proven to be somewhat of an issue that you're dealing with in your product, or are you finding that it's not as big a challenge as maybe it would seem?
Latency has been so it's a little bit longer when an image is in the conversation. Then it can start to feel like you're waiting for a second or something like that. But our current latency is something along the line of is less than a second. It's like 600 800 milliseconds, and it ends up being pretty fast. In fact, one of the issues, and the reason why we're focusing on building something that tells Shirley when to not reply is that latency is so low. And so it ends up being a very very conversational sort of interaction. In fact, the videos that I sent are undoctored. There was no time warping in them, and or anything like that. And so I think people are very very pleased with the latency, but there are issues where it's a little too low, and so interjecting at the wrong times, things interrupting, things that should be happening like that. And so we're focusing on fixing those issues without making the latency too much, although those might increase the latency temporarily while we sort of figure out how to do that better. So this sort of thing is kind of bread and butter, but it's an important aspect of making a co-pilot that actually feels like a co-pilot, as opposed to somebody who's the high school, as you say, the high school kind of lover saying goodbye every time they're having an exchange.
Huh.
When you're planning on making the version for actually being in flight, will Shirley be listening to the radio as well? Will that be the helper that says, "Hey, I think they called you if you didn't reply"? How's that working?
So, you can see with some of the existing companies, in fact, there are some very good examples of companies that are providing tools that you can talk to via Bluetooth while you're flying, and they can listen to you while you're flying. The challenge is if you also want to listen to the intercom, so you have to start to have adapters and things like that. And as a software company, you don't want to get into really the business of building adapters or things like that. You want to use sort of off-the-shelf adapters, and so there are some sort of hiccups to doing that. However, I've talked to some avionics makers. They're very interested in being able to provide high-quality transcriptions of things that are happening, over the radio. And so one of the hopes that we have is also through our process of continuing to develop Shirley that we can provide something maybe to some avionics makers that would allow them to better do the two-stage sort of process of first speech to text and then sort of like a kind of a rough, like an overview pass, an editorial pass of, turning things that don't make sense in certain places into things that make sense. And so, if we could sort of provide that along the way, it'll provide a lot of value to people being able to just sort of see whether or not something was for you, or maybe being able to incorporate a directive into your FMS directly or something like that. So there could be a lot of value there.
Yeah, that first step is to digitize it, and then you can start analyzing it. But I guess taking that first step is where you're at right now.
Right.
Okay. So how does the intelligence model behind Shirley learn specifics about the POH for your airplane, for example? How do you teach Shirley, or how will you in the future?
Yeah.
So that it's getting the right version of the POH. You can't just get this generically off the internet. It has to be for your serial number, right? It has to be for there any number of things. And then I've got a follow-up question on other data as well that it needs. So go ahead.
Absolutely. No, that's great. So if we're talking about the version of, so if you're working with like a flight school and you're trying to give representative training to the students of the flight school, or if you're working with providing a version of an app that then pilots fly with, you have to get the right numbers.
Yep.
You can't just sort of, make something up that, I heard on the internet.
It can't be a chat GPT type answer, right? That's what I'm getting at.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Even though those sorts of answers end up being quite good at sort of a generic case, if you have a drop down like we do in Shirley, where it's like, oh, you're flying a 172. You're like, okay. 172. Okay. Well, so it'll be about this, right? So the process that we'll do is to have a place where people can ingest their own checklist, ingest sort of the POH. We'll have a system that allows somebody just to drop the PDF, sort of, do a first pass, sort of digitizing that, have something clean it up for them. Be like, here's the sort of information that will appear if you ask questions. It'll be from here. And there's a lot of processes that you could follow in order to make sure that you're getting the right sort of data. Yeah. So one of those is, tell the system to not actually give a number, because it can just make up a number. Instead, it'll give sort of the index to the place inside, like the section number where that number is found. And you sort of label that number inside of the POH somewhere. And so it outputs the index, and then before you speak anything, you go and you grab that information from the actual book. And then, so you can kind of make sure that, things are, working appropriately. And so this is the absolute stuff that needs to be done prior to shipping in the airplane.
Yep.
Precisely, but also very important to flight schools before that ends up, shipping out for them. But for sure, it's very important, before getting into the cockpit. One of the things that we'll also be implementing is, feedback. So somebody has a problem with the number, or they're surprised by something. it's important to be able to capture that and be able to essentially incorporate that and say, okay, maybe we should take a look at how this performed. So, feedback and sort of human judgment on whether or not Shirley did something good.
And maybe a safe
Very
word when she's leading you astray, right? Like, okay, leave me alone for a while.
The safe word in FlyShirley.com right now is, by all means, definitely mute.
Oh, okay, perfect.
That is the safe word here.
Excellent. Okay, so my related question then is, what about future integration? Maybe you have it now, but I'm guessing future integration with other real-time data that might prove handy to assimilate into answers and so on, like ADS-B data, GPS data, data that's coming from ForeFlight, or things like that. Kind of how are you taking that into account?
Right. So we're starting by using this really convenient interface that X-Plane just launched called the WebSocket interface that allows you to not have to install a plugin in order to be able to have data go to Shirley. And so that's been really very convenient. We're looking at releasing an app version of Shirley. There are other sort of platforms that provide these sort of data streams. So ADS-B is a good example, but you can have a data stream from Infinite Flight, which is the iPad sort of flight sim, sort of one of the leaders there. And, you could incorporate Shirley that way. Of course, in the cockpit, you could have the GPS from the sky onto your phone, but of course you and the altimeter, actually now there's also altimeters built into phones. Believe it or not, there's barometric sensors. But yes, the ADS-B that comes in has a lot more reliable data. You should use that. One of the things that we've been focusing on as well, and one of the reasons why we are sort of doing this sort of data process is so that Shirley will pay more attention to the particular aviation context. And so one of the things that we've noticed is that existing really big sort of language models are not very good at paying attention to the state of flight. And so even though you might have information related to sort of your altitude and your descent rate and, your bank angle and things like this, the system might not fully be appreciating the fact that you're about to land or you already have landed, and instead relying more on the story to think about, whether you've landed or not. And so part of that is that these sort of models like to sometimes reason best by doing this kind of chain of thought thing. It's like, you could tell it this, you could say something like, okay, Shirley, using the information that you see related to altitude and rate of descent, what would you say we're in the current phase of flight? And then it could say something along the lines of descent rate is 500 feet per minute. Altitude is 500 feet AGL. We're about to land. And, what is really important is to be able to skip those steps and just for Shirley to be able to understand that you're about to land. And so bigger and better and badder models are able to appreciate those factors, but also by tuning the models using that sort of information, you're able to skip those steps and have it pay more attention to the particulars.
Because we've got
other opportunities to do this.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, there's other opportunities also to do things called multimodal models where, essentially one channel is the flight data and then the other channels are the speech. And, you could have two different channels feeding the model so that at all points it has some concept of, your state of flight that it's generating and also some concept of the story that things are kind of
and that's kind of what I had in my mind.
Or you can just take it into text land too.
Right. And that's sort of what I had in my mind because we have access to these relatively inexpensive ADHARs and things like that, like in the Century, right? So that's kind of, is that kind of part of your roadmap is to have that multimodal approach?
And that's one of the cool reasons for starting with SIGs too, is because they have all that same data.
Got it.
You're just getting it streamed from the flight sim.
Exactly.
And so you could absolutely trade to pay attention to this thing, especially for a smaller model, which would have a lot more trouble paying attention to the correct things without tons of prompting, et cetera. And so being able to provide these sort of pairs and being able to train these sort of models to pay attention to the phase of flight, that's a huge opportunity.
Very interesting. And you mentioned,
that's a great question.
You mentioned these massive models that, they're going to get super models and things like that. Not the way I thought about those supermodels in high school. It's different. But so I thought you'd like that, Tiffany.
Gotta have one joke like that in
I was
every
waiting
podcast.
for it.
So my question then is, I think you're iOS only, right? Today?
So right now we're X-Plane only.
X-Plane
we actually run
only.
in the
Okay.
browser, and so we're
Running in the browser.
platform
Okay,
agnostic,
thank you. So you're probably thinking about how this will run in the cockpit and so on. And so I'm wondering how important the differences that you're seeing between, the A chips in an iPhone versus now, most of the iPads are getting M chips. How important is that to you to be able to do this edge processing as you go forward? Is that going to be a big deal for you? Like you'll be able to fork your or change your application based on the power that it has. If it's running on an iPad that has an M4 in it, it's going to be able to do different things than if it's running on a phone with an alpha chip or with an A chip, right?
Right. No, I think it's massively important. In fact, this is only the first year where you might have a mobile phone which is powerful enough in order to be able to run an AI model on it at all.
Right.
And so, the iPhone Pros that exist right now can run AI models that, my iPad here can run. There's two aspects. One of them has been just sort of making models a lot more efficient and sort of packing more punch into these models. So a really good one is one of the smaller sort of these Meta created these models called the Llama series of models that are open source. And so you can essentially, start to think about bringing some of those things to mobile, and, the opportunity there is massive. So you can run some of these models already on iPads. The kind of historical ones are really not that smart. They kind of ramble and confabulate is really the kind of the term of art related to that. And then the ones that you can now run on the iPhone will have to be sort of tuned by us and with the sort of data that we collect in order to be smart for the task, be able to be relevant for the task. And, the idea is to be able to upgrade when somebody has internet connection.
Right.
I think is really the fundamental.
Exactly.
And there's different ways of looking at how do you get internet connection. And so,
And
when I was
presumably
flying around,
it'll send learning data as well once they have a connection. I'm guessing. So
right?
it's not only going to enhance
it's important.
Go ahead. Sorry, we got a little lag.
Yeah, it's important to have feedback. It's important to have that's all right. It's important to have feedback on whether or not what somebody experienced was good or not. And so, of course, you don't want to be exfiltrating all sorts of data while you're in flight.
Right.
In fact, that's a lot of what the sim community is for, is to be able to try out some of these things and be able to ensure that these things are safe. And so I think when I think about flight data, I'm a lot more kind of a little bit more hesitant to think about kind of sucking that data off the phone, especially if it's all running on somebody's phone without having to use anything on the cloud at all. And but it is important to have some sort of feedback mechanism. So that really has to be tread very kind of lightly. Ultimately think about how to provide these sort of technologies to airlines. You have pilots unions. Nobody wants to be able to have that, like, listening to them. Their livelihood is on the line. It's just, it's not.
Yeah, you guys,
it's not something
you guys
to
have a
play
lot of
with, so.
big CS questions ahead of you to answer, don't you?
Yeah, it's a really, really fun time.
Yeah.
I feel like a combination somehow now as a grown up now, I get to say that I'm combining a lot of interest within aviation with computer science, and if there's other people out there that see this as an interesting opportunity, they should reach out, especially if they're on the East Coast.
We're really in front of that hockey stick curve, aren't we? I mean, we're just in the infancy of all of this.
I think that's what makes it such a fun time to be building things. And, our favorite thing is to be able to work with customers directly. And so, we have our Discord channel where it's really exciting to see people chime in. It's airplane.team/Discord if you want to get on there.
All right.
But the people who join, we end up interacting and sometimes they're willing to hop on a phone call and give us some feedback. Sometimes they're posting YouTube videos about things, and that they experience with Shirley, flights through New York or different experiences with Shirley, or kind of funny videos from, Sinfluencers, which I think is an awesome subcategory of the internet. Sinfluencers. It's amazing. And so we learned so much from that. And I think there's just the enthusiasm in this space to see people really enjoying using their sims and seeing what's possible in sims. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting companies that are shipping things for sims now. You have like the ATC land, and you have the sort of say intentions and beyond ATC and P2 ATC, which are using all this AI stuff to be able to enable really good ATC. It's an amazing time to be kind of building and also being a flight simmer, and so it just couldn't be any more fun if I could think about it.
All right. Well, I've exhausted the geek out portion on the product, so I'm gonna give Tiffany a chance to ask some of her pent up questions that I know she's got, and then I want to really kind of geek out on the aviation learning side of this. I've got some questions about that too. So, go ahead, Tiffany.
I think all my
Perfect.
questions were answered.
Oh, good. All right. All right. Well, I've got a few then. We've talked a little bit about how Shirley could be used in the training environment. I would love to hear your thoughts, go a little bit deeper into how Shirley would integrate, and I mean this in a non-technical way, but integrate with a human CFI to augment and enhance what they're doing with a student or with a client who's doing some advanced training.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we see, just to be clear again and reiterate, like we see Shirley as being a supplement to professional instruction.
Right.
There's a portion of practice that Shirley can provide a lot of value in, and it's actually pretty good. But there are so many conceptual things that only a human can see. And plus, there'll be things that Shirley does miss, and there'll be opportunities to enhance sort of some of the style. And if there are also unknowns related to some aspects of this training, but what is really valuable about it is being able to show up prepared for your lesson and to be able to do fine. You might have missed a week with your instructor due to weather, or somebody got sick, and now you're like looking at potentially needing to repeat a lesson, or you just went out and did some training with an instructor and you had these deficiencies, you need sort of this retraining, or you started with your PPL, you had these maneuvers, you were you're kind of bad at turns at a point, and now you're gonna go, you got your IFR, you're really like book smart, you got your IFR really easy, and now you're back in commercial land, you got 8s on pylons, just like, oh goodness gracious, and you're struggling. And so maybe for somebody who is having an integrated sort of training program that includes Shirley, then they could have some sort of knowledge that, yes, actually in PPL time, you are pretty deficient in these sort of areas. In fact, you might want to actually put some extra energy into them before you go out and start working on these 8s on pylons, or between your instruments, or after you get your instrument, make out an airplane, or do it in the sim. And so there's some level of integration that you would want to have, maybe between your for-flight pilot sort of logbook. There's some people who take the logs real seriously inside of the electronic logbooks. Some people don't take them quite as seriously as the opportunity with the actual paper logbook, because there's a flight track and things like that associated with electronic logbooks. Sometimes you feel like it might not be as influential, but for if that data is there, then it'd be really good to be able to grab that and be able to provide that to Shirley as part of your sort of private pilot sort of preparation, and have your pilot notes related to what did you feel like you did right and did wrong, and what areas did Shirley believe that you might need a little bit more practice on. Include those in sort of a logbook that's integrated between your real flying and your virtual flying, and be able to help people become a lot more prepared. And then to have instructors be able to try this stuff out. Maybe they already used it themselves, or maybe they have heard about it and just think it's maybe worthwhile just to have if you're tired at the end of the day, or like, and what your setup is, and you have like a yoke and your laptop, and now you have to like go to your desk in order to like plug it in. It's like you're kind of tired. It'd be nice to have somebody like provide a little bit of extra to get you over that sort of line. And so you sort of show up, and Shirley's like, let's go. You ready to do blah, blah, blah? And you're like, all right, like I'm just there enough to be able to practice this right now. Thanks to Shirley being like at 125% as usual. And so with that in mind, there are different sort of styles of training and different styles of learning and teaching. And I think one of the interesting things with Shirley is that what people don't know is that they can, if they're not enjoying or if it's not working for them in a particular way, you can actually just tell Shirley to do it differently, and Shirley will actually do something differently. You can just ask for a different sort of approach to working with you. So, there is some opportunity if Shirley is getting that last word in too much to be like, hey, can you just like not do that or mute so that we're not doing this?
From the old Saturday Night Live days, you could have her respond appropriately to simmer down now, right?
Yeah.
So
you could.
So do you see?
You could. And
I couldn't resist. You might be a little too young for that, Alex, but you might not remember that. But do you see?
me, no.
What's that?
I said me, not too young.
Oh, yeah,
No,
yeah.
No, I might be.
Do you see maybe a future where there could be almost a three-way collaboration between a professional CFI,
Yes.
the learner, and Shirley, where there's feedback going both ways, kind of from what the learner may have done on their own in solo practice, kind of some of that feedback making it to the CFI to help the CFI understand where to put emphasis and things like that. Do you see that kind of in the future as well?
Right. So in fact, I at Oshkosh this year, I met a company called Noble Flight Sim. They make these really cool sort of SR22, SR20 sort of home flight sims that are advanced aviation training devices. So if you own one of those
Really?
airplanes, you can actually have it in your house and be able to have sort of do instrument proficiency. They have like it's like a 20 to 40 to $50,000 piece of kit, right?
Yeah.
So, it's an expensive
Well,
thing.
they're
and
also
SR22
flying
is
$1
pretty
million
expensive
airplane
as well.
So
Yeah. Those are pretty expensive too. But one of the interesting things that they are thinking about is how to provide some level of remote instruction.
oh yeah,
And so there is a really big opportunity. And in fact, there are some companies right now that already provide, there's one flight sim coach that provides remote instruction between, I don't endorse, I'm not like personally familiar with them, but it is a company where you, and I don't not endorse it for the record. It just is a really cool company that's out there that provides
you don't know enough about
to be able
it,
to pop
so,
into.
Yes, I got it.
I don't know enough about it,
Yeah.
either. But like but it's a really cool concept where you have an instructor who's able to join you in a simulation session. Now, if you combine that, a few things you combine in here, you combine a AI sort of Shirley to provide some level of instruction, and then you have the ability to kind of connect in an instructor to be able to provide sort of the verification of how somebody is actually doing in their progress. And you sort of have a really neat combination, the sort of thing that we were talking about in the kind of commercial spectrum, which would be really useful for them, but also something that could provide sort of a combination. You don't necessarily get home and you don't necessarily have something scheduled with somebody. You want to practice, and so Shirley's really good because you can just sort of show up and Shirley's ready. And then, there's a opportunity, of course, to be able to provide that sort of connection. And so a lot of our technology that our technology that provides this sort of connection with Shirley and the individual's technology that could be able to provide that sort of session between an individual and another individual. And that's something we're really excited to be able to do because, not just in, and to varying degrees as well. So you'd be able to have theoretically at its extreme, you think about it to a logical conclusion, you could have a VR headset that you're sitting inside the airplane, you're able to interact with all the controls. You can have an instructor actually sit next to you in sort of this virtual space inside of your airplane and be able to sort of see you as you're doing these sort of things. I think this is sort of the logical conclusion where things go. You send a VR headset to somebody, Shirley can help get them prepared to be familiar with this airplane. You have an instructor join them next to them inside of the cockpit, and be able to verify that they know how to operate this vehicle. And so this is absolutely where this sort of our part of our ground game vision of how we bring sort of advanced training and make it a lot more accessible and representative to all sorts of flight, between like maneuvers to sort of flight training device style, sort of instrument training, and et cetera, and looking to do that as part of FlyShirley. Absolutely. So that's a great and relevant question.
Cool. So, as it pertains to teaching, one of the things that keeps coming up in my mind is that this is super ambitious, right? So, where we met, there's another company, doing a co-pilot sort of approach, and we're actually going to be
Goose, yeah.
Goose. And we're going to actually be talking to them in a couple of weeks for the same reasons. This is all very interesting, but what they're doing is much more, I would say, focused on a very specific use case of being your co-pilot in the cockpit, whereas you're taking the approach of being sort of a lot of different things to a pilot, to a simmer, to a pilot, to a learner, to somebody who's flying. It's very, very ambitious. How do you balance what you're doing with what you can deliver right now? How's that going, and how are you walking that line?
I think that's an insightful question for two reasons. One of them is that it's realistic to be able to only it's realistic to say, hey, you're looking at doing this entire scope of things. What can you actually look off? But I think there's another sort of conceptual reason why that's an insightful question, is that it's actually challenging. If you're an individual hearing about what we're doing, it can be challenging to think, okay, how does this fit into my life in particular? I think, and so I think there's a few different ways, and I'll try to get back to the question also of, how are we balancing it long term as well? And so the answer to the former question, the thing that we provide right now is a AI co-pilot that connects into your flight sim, and you can either fly with in sort of an open sort of setting. It's not just a deadhead, it flips switches, it interacts with the sim for you. It can be sort of a kind of like a co-pilot. It's your buddy,
smarter co-pilot.
Shirley.
Yeah,
it's pretty fun.
Right.
And the other aspect that we're working on right now is through our challenges system. And so we have this sort of concept that we're building off of, which is challenges. Challenges have enabled us to build sort of fun experiences, from the ALIA sort of training challenge to also our entire kind of training curriculum. And so what we're providing and what we're hoping to get feedback on, in part through having conversations like this, is to have pilots try out this sort of private pilot curriculum and see if it's meeting their needs and be able to give feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it would be fair to say right now that Shirley is an early adopter's product. So it is absolutely fair to say that, you try Shirley, it works, the product works, but there are things that you can provide feedback on, and then within a day or two, we go and we build it. And you provide that sort of feedback, and you have this sort of iteration process. We're talking August 20th, 2024. Hopefully in a few months, we'll be through that sort of process within private pilot curriculum, just like we're starting to get through that process related to some of the co-pilot stuff right now. And, we'll continue to do that. We're working with a company that has a few hundred employees. And so we'll be getting feedback with them using our product to see how they Shirley. A lot of those people are becoming pilots as well. We're working to develop this product. As a startup company, your major prerogative is to grow.
Yes.
And so you kind of are like this little silkworm, and you're like trying to find light, and you're like trying to have put energy into what works, and like maybe don't worry too much about what's about things that are not really working out. It's kind of like you water the plants
Or
that
the,
are growing as opposed to the kind of
yeah, you got to
the
figure out a way
arid,
to make
desolate
revenue,
soil
right?
of your garden. That
That's not always that clear.
totally
It's not always that clear when you're doing
right.
something conceptual like this. It's like, okay, well, where does the revenue come from? It's not that easy of a question to answer.
Yeah.
And so what we end up doing is we work really closely with the customers that we have. And so we end up having these really close customer relationships where we find out things that are important. We watch the videos that they're posting if they're streamers, and then we end up figuring out how to make their lives better. Fundamentally, trying to build something that people want. I think it is still very insightful to be able to say that there are there are a huge number of things that this could be, and there are a huge number of things that we're building towards. I think we're in an excellent position to be able to start with these really kind of large group of enthusiastic home flight sim users, help them bridge from sim to sky, and be able to provide training and integrate with other sort of training platforms and curriculum to help them be kind of having a one-stop shop that could help them get into the cockpit. But the idea that people who trained with Shirley would want to fly with Shirley in an actual airplane because they would have had this experience. And so I think there is a path from sim to sky that makes sense for a company with sort of the data pipelines and things like this that could set up really nicely to make this all sort of possible. Yeah, but if you're a customer today, the question is, if you have X-Plane, August 20th, 2024, if you have X-Plane and you are interested in flying with Shirley and you're interested in training, then it's a great time to get involved. It's a great time to join the Discord and interact. And as we sort of build this out, and we're excited to have more people to work with and learn more about what customers want and sort of build something directly on that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a really selfish question, but maybe this will extrapolate to many of your future customers. I think it will. I'm kind of an everyman. So when you and I first started talking about how Fly with Shirley could be used in a training environment, my brain started going to all sorts of places that would help me specifically, and maybe extrapolate to other people, like I said.
Yeah.
When I'm studying for a rating, for a test, for for a check ride, an oral, whatever, or maybe I'm just doing some instrument, some approaches, and I start to ask myself some questions. I'll spend the next hour to 2 hours diving into the aim and into the FARs and trying to find answers to my questions. So the first thing that popped into my mind is I would love to have a resource that's so aviation specific like this that I could ask questions or have a conversation that is something like, off the top of my head, Shirley, what does a vertical descent point look like on a chart? And it can show me, or it might be, can you explain the differences between these two approaches? Or remind me what the three different types, maybe it's four, I don't know, the three different types of night are. I'm trying to think of examples. That's probably not the best example because that's pretty easy to look up. But I'm trying to think of examples where you would want to get specific with Shirley on things that you're not going to get from an internet search, because what you're going to get from an internet search is a bunch of different opinions, maybe a podcast, maybe a YouTube video that's on the subject, that sort of thing. But I might want Shirley to help guide me in the research I would have done anyway and help me do it faster. So in other words, it pulls together the answer, but then points to the resources so that I can quickly go read the FAR, that specific section, and see in the aim, the chart that they have, that sort of thing. I hope I'm getting across what I'm asking. Is that something you're thinking about?
Right. And so I think there are absolutely aspects of that we're thinking about. When you start to think about how Shirley can provide a virtual check ride, then there are questions you'd want to be able to ask related to that.
Yes.
And then if the DPE says, "Well, I actually don't really know the answer," look, you tell me. Now, that doesn't really sort of scratch the itch that you're
Right.
talking about here. What I will say is that we plan to back up Shirley with all the references from the FAR, of course, the FARing, and all these sort of all the handbooks, all the flying handbooks, the POHs, etc. There are sort of like hinterlands where you have sort of like FAA legal department decision papers on
Yes.
what hours you can
The
bill,
legal
or
opinions
who's
and
wearing
stuff,
the hood, and who's
Yeah.
just like you get into that absolute wild land of questions that I think are really good questions. They're the sort of questions that I used to get crickets to when I would put it on our sort of discussion forum. It'd be like, who cares? Like, why are you or this is like such a specific IFR question related to WASP versus not. These are the sort of like very kind of insightful questions that need to be kind of built through.
I've got some logging
I wonder
questions
whether
right now. Here I am. I've been a private pilot for 15 years or something like that. And here I am at the commercial level and about to finish my CFI. And I was looking at my logbook the other day, about ready to enter some stuff. And I'm hitting situations where I'm going, I don't actually know the proper way to log this. Like, it's not your typical, like, I've got a safety pilot situation, or I won't go into details, but my point is, I would love to have a resource, because I even know that most of my instructors that I know are probably going to go, yeah, I don't know. So it would be amazing to have a resource that would help you discover the answer for yourself by walking you along a path. Well, I don't know, good question. Let's look at this. Well, what about this? And, it would just be incredible to have a resource like that,
I think that this could be in the good wheelhouse for companies that are providing sort of ground
that's true.
training materials.
Yeah, good point.
Where you sort of provide some sort of like AI engine to be able to give some sort of insights related to some of these questions.
Yeah.
I think with the format of Shirley currently, and as much as we were just talking about how we were intending Shirley to be everything to everyone,
right. You've got
it's
to
not entirely true.
You've got to put a limit somewhere, right?
Yes.
Right. We're bridging from sim to sky, but we're looking to basically be the co-pilot, sort of sitting. Shirley is your co-pilot friend sitting next to you in the cockpit, who can also provide some level of training and instruction, not necessarily going to like write up a PDF that has references to things.
Right.
Although, like, I will say that we'll come back to you and be able to get your feedback on that in some time. Let's say let's say your what you're saying probably resonates with what a lot of other students experience, which is really stumper questions that are super hard. In fact, I've met some people who are working on these sort of written based, sort of like you type it out, your question, and then it's like providing reference sort of feedback. I met somebody like that at Oshkosh. I wish I had his card at the top of my mind. Again, another person that I haven't tried I barely tried their stuff, and it seems cool. We should check it out, type of deal. But the solution there, I think, is a kind of thing that spits out text that's permanent, that has references, and is very book
Interesting. Yeah.
We do want to be part of a one-stop, and that is a place where AI can take a lot of advantage. What we'd like to be able to do is be able to talk to you about those sort of things, pull in the relevant information, so that while you're kind of having this discourse, that could be an important thing, or take a note for you to be able to look that sort of thing up, because you might be flying an approach and you're like, my goodness, what the heck is that?
Yep.
And you want to remember that later, and so you'll be able to have that as sort of a flight note that then ends up in your inside of your logbook or follow-up or action items that happen afterwards.
Yeah.
And I think it's really cool to be able to think about Shirley as being part of a one-stop shop related to some level of ground instruction, you have a ground instruction integrated with a, you have ground instruction integrated with private pilot maneuvers, integrated with private pilot sort of checks through check ride preparation. And so, I think it is conceivable that we could get into building a whole learning management system that provides a sort of this sort of text-based thing, but we're not doing it right now.
Right.
And I think that needs to be seen. So I will be the exception to say that we're not saying that we're everything to everybody.
Awesome.
And that's my example.
Look, we came full circle on that. Look at that.
That's right. Yeah.
Did you say what year you started this? Was it? I see March 2024 on your LinkedIn.
Yes, March 2024.
It's brand new. They're at their first MVP, basically. Well, a little past it now, but yeah.
So Flight Sim Expo was our MVP. That was in July, and so beginning of July. And so we've just been public for a couple months now, and so anyway.
Excellent. Well,
it's real exciting. It's super fun.
It is very exciting, and it's hard to comprehend sometimes where all of this can go. But we certainly appreciate your time helping bend our brains a little bit around the possibilities, and because I know you've been thinking about this a lot more than we have, so we do appreciate your time.
Well, it's been like
I think on the pilot cast, I could be wrong. I know we at least used to hang out with the ForeFlight guys, or they were kind of in that circle, and it was this tiny little startup, and like no one's ever gonna let you use your phone in the cockpit, and then look at it now.
And
so
look at it now,
it's really exciting to see this.
Well, and they're starting to use.
Thanks very much,
I mean, it's a
Tiffany.
totally different thing, but they're starting to use big data as well. They're pulling data from those ADHARs and the Sentries to be able to do automatic PIREPs on turbulence. And so they're using models to filter out normal operations so that they can see where turbulence is happening. They know the airplane, they know the type, they know the weight of the airplane, they know exactly where it's at, they know what altitude it's at, they know what direction it's heading, and they're filtering out normal airplane movement, and what they're left with is that was turbulence, and that this is the level of that turbulence. That's pretty incredible stuff. I mean, it's totally different than what you're doing, but the idea of being able to take large amounts of data from a lot of different places and give real-time insights to users of the application, it's really amazing what we're going to be able to do over the next 10, 15 years.
I'm going to say that there are so many, these companies that started in the last generation of product, whereas essentially, we have these new iPhones and iPads. How can we bring charts to them and then also make pilots' lives a lot better? Those things have gotten so good. I mean, you look at ForeFlight, it's just an amazing piece of technology. It has all the data you can possibly want in the entire world. And now what's really neat about this sort of technological sort of transition is that there are all these really cool companies that exist now to sort of look about this next generation. So you have Goose is a really good example of that. You have sort of Say Intentions AI, beyond ATC. You have Shirley in this sort of category of being able to provide training and eventually be able to get back into a cockpit with something that's pretty conversational. You have companies like Loft Dynamics, which are making sort of VR certified sims for maybe 30, like divide by 20 the cost of the existing certified sims.
Right.
And it's just an incredible time, I would say, to be a pilot, a simmer, a flight school. Just so many things are getting a lot better. And,
a startup.
And a startup.
Let's face it, though, it's always a great time to be a pilot.
That's true.
That's always a good time.
I
totally
resist. Excellent. Oh, this is
always good to have.
This has been really fun and really enlightening. So, Alex, wonderful time. We appreciate it. We've held you long enough, so we'll let you go. Anything that we forgot to ask or didn't ask that we should have, you want to make sure we cover?
Well, I'll just encourage folks that they can, follow along with what we're up to over at airplane.team/discord or /blog if they're curious. You know, we love pilots. We love simmers. We love talking to our customers. You know, it's real important to us that pilots and aviators and instructors continue to flourish. We want to see more people becoming pilots. We really care about this entire industry. I love flying, and you know, just want to wish everybody to fly safe. And it's been really good talking to you, Bill and Tiffany.
Beautiful.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. This was great. We look forward to seeing you at Oshkosh next year. Are you going to have a booth?
Likewise. But think we'd like to probably figure out something like that for next year.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, it's probably going to be a good time.
I think so.
Well, thanks again.